Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Think about trying to parallel park a heavy wooden wagon on a narrow, rutted dirt road.
Right. Which, takes a fair amount of spatial awareness and just a lot of physical effort.
Yeah, and you need cooperation from the animals pulling it, too. So apply that exact same concept to a continuous, unbroken line of those wagons, just side by side, stretching from the center of Washington, D.C., all the way north to the harbor of Baltimore.
I mean, that is a 50-mile-long rolling traffic jam.
It is. And in the early summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee dragged that exact logistical burden across the Potomac River and up into the agricultural heartland of Pennsylvania.
And that physical reality, moving an army of that size in the mid-19th century, it's something that often gets lost in the strategic overviews when we do a deep dive into this campaign.
Right, because we tend to just look at the sources and focus on the lines on the map, or, the grand flanking maneuvers and the decisive charges.
Exactly. But those armies were living, breathing organisms. They required an astronomical amount of fuel just to function. I mean, Lee marched into Pennsylvania with roughly 72,000 troops.
Which is a massive footprint.
It is. And to keep them fed, to keep their ammunition supplied, and transport their tents and forges and medical equipment, he required thousands of wagons and, tens of thousands of mules and draft horses.
And the staggering part of that equation for you listening is all those animals needed to eat, too.
Yeah, they do.
So you're dedicating a massive portion of your cargo capacity simply to hauling the grain and hay necessary to feed the engines that are pulling the cargo.
It really becomes this vicious mathematical cycle, because if you sit in one place for too long, your army consumes literally everything within a 20-mile radius.
Right, and then you begin to starve.
Exactly. And that underlying mathematical reality, it dictated almost every major operational decision during this campaign. Lee's army had to move, and they had to spread out.
Because they were operating deep in hostile territory.
Right.
They couldn't rely on a protected supply line stretching all the way back to Virginia.
No, not at all. The railroads were either torn up or they were controlled by Union forces. Therefore, the Army of Northern Virginia was forced to forage on the local economy.
They had to systematically sweep through the Cumberland Valley.
Yeah, requisitioning livestock, crops, shoes, medical supplies, basically taking it from the local civilian population.
And the sources actually outline the precise methods used for this extraction. It wasn't always just a chaotic pillaging operation, though, that certainly happened at times.
Right. It was often more formalized. Confederate quartermasters would present local farmers with promissory notes,
which were receipts payable in Confederate currency. They exchanged those for herds of cattle, draft horses, stores of grain.
But to a Pennsylvania farmer in 1863, a piece of paper backed by the Confederate government was essentially worthless.
Yeah, completely useless to them. But it provided a veneer of military legality to the confiscation.
Exactly. And because they needed to extract such an immense volume of material just to sustain 72,000 men, the Confederate forces could not march together in a single column.
They had to fan out across a wide front, utilizing multiple parallel road networks.
Right. So you have some corps near Chambersburg, others are probing toward Carlisle, and some elements even reach the banks of the Susquehanna River up near Harrisburg.
So this dispersal solves the immediate logistical crisis of feeding the army.
Yes.
But it creates a severe operational vulnerability.
Exactly. The most basic principle of warfare is concentration of force.
Right. So if you are spread out over 40 miles of countryside, you cannot easily bring your entire weight to bear if the enemy suddenly appears in front of one of your isolated columns.
And that vulnerability is compounded by the fact that Lee was operating with a severe lack of intelligence regarding where the Union Army actually was.
Which brings us to Major General J.E.B. Stuart, Lee's cavalry commander. He was absent during the critical days leading up to the battle.
Yeah, and in 19th century warfare, the cavalry functioned as the eyes and ears of the army. They were supposed to operate on the fringes of the infantry column.
Just screening their movements from the enemy, right? And probing forward to locate the main body of the opposing force.
That was the job. But Stuart had taken his elite cavalry divisions on a wide, circuitous ride, completely around the rear of the Union Army. He was seeking to capture supply wagons and disrupt communications.
But the unintended consequence of that ride was that it severed his communication with Lee.
Completely. For days, Lee was moving his sprawling, disjointed army blindly through Pennsylvania.
He was operating under the assumption that the Union Army of the Potomac was still lingering far to the south in Virginia.
Right. And while Lee was dealing with these intelligence blackouts and, the foraging logistics, the Union forces were experiencing their own severe internal friction.
Yeah, the Army of the Potomac, which numbered roughly 94,000 men, was undergoing a sudden and highly disruptive change in command.
On June 28, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln relieved General Joseph Hooker of command.
And he appointed Major General George Meade to lead the Army.
And the timing of that appointment is so critical to understanding the Union posture here.
Meade was handed command of this massive military apparatus just 3 days before the largest battle of the war commenced.
Which is daunting. If you consider the sheer administrative burden of that transition, it's just incredible. He had to instantly familiarize himself with the precise locations of his 7 infantry corps.
Not to mention his cavalry corps, his artillery reserve, and his own sprawling logistical trains.
Right. And he had to establish relationships with his corps commanders, process all the incoming intelligence reports.
All while actively marching his army northward to intercept Lee.
Exactly. And Meade's primary directive from Washington wasn't necessarily to destroy Lee's army, but to shield the capital cities of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore from Confederate capture.
All right, so with that defensive mandate in mind, Meade was initially cautious. The documents actually show that on June 30th, Meade's engineering staff was actively surveying a defensive line along Big Pipe Creek in northern Maryland.
The Pipe Creek Circular, right. It was a contingency plan. Meade wanted to establish a fortified line behind a natural geographic barrier.
He wanted to dig in and basically force Lee to attack him on ground of Meade's choosing.
Which was a really sound, defensively oriented strategy. It maximized the Union advantage in artillery and manpower.
It was strategically sound, but, the friction of war intervened. The converging road networks of southern Pennsylvania pulled elements of both armies toward a small, relatively obscure crossroads town called Gettysburg.
And the geography of Gettysburg itself is basically the catalyst for the collision.
Yeah, if you look at a 19th century map of Adams County, Gettysburg sits at the center of a hub. It has 10 major roads radiating outward like the spokes of a wagon wheel.
So if you have 2 large armies stumbling blindly around the countryside, searching for each other and searching for supplies.
Those road networks just naturally funnel them toward that central hub.
Exactly. And that funneling effect is exactly what triggered the fighting on the morning of July 1st, 1863.
Because a Confederate infantry division commanded by Major General Henry Heth was advancing eastward down the Chambersburg Pike toward Gettysburg.
And their objective that morning was not to initiate a general engagement. They were a heavy foraging column. They were tasked with securing supplies from the town.
Now, the long-standing historical narrative often focuses on the rumor that Heth's men were specifically looking for a stockpile of shoes in Gettysburg.
Right, the famous shoe myth. But the reality of the Confederate supply situation makes that rumor highly plausible, even if modern historians debate the exact existence of a shoe warehouse there.
Because the southern manufacturing base was severely limited compared to the industrialized North.
Yeah, providing durable footwear for tens of thousands of infantrymen marching on macadamized roads was just a constant, grueling challenge for Confederate quartermasters.
But whether it was driven by shoes or general provisions, Heath pushed his brigades down the pike. And at approximately 7:30 in the morning, his lead elements encountered Union cavalry pickets.
Those pickets were stationed along Hare Ridge, which is about 3 miles west of the town center. And this is where the battle formally begins.
And those Union pickets belonged to a cavalry division commanded by Brigadier General John Buford.
Right. Buford had arrived in the town the previous day. And as a really seasoned cavalry officer, he immediately recognized the tactical value of the terrain.
He saw the rolling ridges to the west and north. But more importantly, he noted the prominent rocky heights located to the south of the town.
Because Buford understood that if the Confederate Army seized those southern heights in force, they would completely dominate the surrounding landscape.
So Buford resolved to hold the ground west of town for as long as possible. He was buying time for the Union infantry to march up from the south and occupy those critical heights.
And to accomplish this, he deployed his 2 brigades, which was roughly 2,700 men, in a deep skirmish line across the ridges.
And the mechanics of Buford's defense rely on a specific technological advantage, right? In this era, cavalry was transitioning from the traditional role of massed charges with sabers to functioning more like highly mobile mounted infantry.
Exactly. Buford's men fought dismounted, so every 4th man was designated as a horse holder, and they led the mounts to safety in the rear.
while the remaining three-quarters of the troopers formed a firing line on foot behind fences and trees.
And their key technological asset here was the breech-loading carbine, specifically the Sharps carbine.
Which is a huge detail.
Yeah.
Because the standard infantry weapon of the war was the rifled musket.
Right. And to load a rifled musket, a soldier had to bite open a paper cartridge,
Pour the black powder down the muzzle.
push the lead bullet into the barrel, withdraw a long metal ramrod, ram the bullet all the way down to the breech, return the ramrod, and then place a small percussion cap on the firing nibble.
Which takes time. A highly trained infantryman, under the stress of combat, could fire perhaps 3 aimed shots per minute.
Yeah, at best. But the Sharps carbine bypassed the muzzle entirely.
The cavalrymen could pull down a lever that dropped the breech block, insert a linen or paper cartridge directly into the rear of the chamber, close the breech, cap the weapon, and fire.
And this streamlined action allowed Buford's men to fire substantially faster than the approaching Confederate infantry.
So that rapid, sustained volume of fire rolling down from Hare Ridge created a false impression in the minds of the Confederate commanders.
It did. Heth believed he had actually encountered a substantial force of entrenched Union infantry.
Consequently, he halted his advance. He ordered his brigades to deploy from marching columns into wide battle lines and called up his artillery batteries to shell the ridges.
And Heth's deployment consumed precious hours. Buford executed a textbook delaying action. He utilized the topography, falling back methodically from Hare Ridge to the next elevation.
McPherson Ridge.
Right, forcing the Confederates to repeatedly halt, dress their lines, and advance over broken ground.
So Buford was trading space for time. He was absorbing the pressure while constantly scanning the southern horizon for reinforcements.
And those reinforcements did arrive mid-morning in the form of Major General John F. Reynolds, commanding the vanguard of the Union First Corps.
Reynolds was one of the most respected officers in the Army of the Potomac, commanding the left wing of the army.
He rode forward, met with Buford, surveyed the mounting Confederate pressure, and made what was really the definitive tactical decision of the campaign.
He ordered his infantry corps to rush forward and relieve the exhausted cavalrymen.
Yeah, he sent couriers riding frantically back to Meade, informing that he was advancing in force and that he intended to barricade the roads and fight them right there.
And that singular decision committed the Army of the Potomac. The Pipe Creek Circular was dead. The battle would be fought at Gettysburg.
Tragically, though, Reynolds was killed mere moments after committing his troops.
Yeah, while actively directing the deployment of the famous Iron Brigade into a patch of timber known as Erbst Woods, Reynolds was struck in the back of the neck by a bullet and died almost instantly.
And the sudden loss of their wing commander, that sent a shockwave through the Union leadership on the field.
But despite the loss of Reynolds, the Union First Corps held their ground fiercely through the late morning and into the afternoon.
However, the geographic funnel of the road network that we talked about earlier was bringing more Confederate forces to the field.
Right. Lieutenant General A.P. Hill's Third Corps arrived from the west to support Heth.
And at the same time, Lieutenant General Richard Ewell's Second Corps began arriving from the north, marching down the Carlisle and Harrisburg roads.
And the arrival of Ewell's Corps fundamentally altered the tactical geometry of the battlefield.
It did, because the Union forces, now augmented by the arrival of the 11th Corps, formed a right angle north and west of the town.
And Ewell's advance struck the hinge of that exact angle.
Yeah, so the sheer weight of converging Confederate numbers eventually overwhelmed the Union defenders.
The defense collapsed in the late afternoon. The retreat of the 11th Corps and the 1st Corps was heavily contested and very chaotic.
Union soldiers were pushed back through the narrow streets and alleys of Gettysburg, taking fire from side streets and houses.
Thousands of Union troops were trapped and taken prisoner during the confusion in the town.
But the surviving Union regiments retreated southward and began rallying on a prominent elevation just outside the town limits, which was Cemetery Hill.
Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, who had been dispatched by Meade to take command of the field following Reynolds' death, arrived and immediately began organizing a cohesive defensive perimeter on that high ground.
Right, and as the evening of July 1st approached, the Confederates had secured a clear tactical victory. They had driven 2 Union corps from the field and inflicted severe casualties.
And from his vantage point on Seminary Ridge, General Lee observed the Union forces consolidating on Cemetery Hill.
Recognizing the danger of allowing the enemy to fortify the high ground, Lee sent a message to General Ewell, whose corps was closest to the hill.
And the order Lee sent remains one of the most intensely analyzed communications in military history.
It really is. Lee directed Ewell to carry the hill occupied by the enemy, if he found it practicable, but to avoid a general engagement until the arrival of the rest of the army.
And that phrase, if practicable, is the pivot point. It delegated the final decision to Ewell based on his assessment of the immediate local conditions.
And Ewell weighed his options, surveyed his forces, and chose not to launch an assault on Cemetery Hill that evening.
And now Ewell's decision is frequently cited as a failure of aggressive command, right? With many arguing that his predecessor, the late Stonewall Jackson, would have attacked without hesitation.
That's a very common narrative, but analyzing the operational data available to Ewell reveals a very constrained reality.
Because Ewell's divisions had been marching in the July heat and fighting for hours.
Yeah, they were highly disorganized after navigating the urban terrain of the town. His men were exhausted, and their ammunition was heavily depleted.
And beyond the fatigue of the infantry, we have to look at the massive logistical footprint choking the roads behind them.
Exactly. Ewell was waiting for the arrival of his 3rd Division, commanded by Major General Edward Johnson, to provide the necessary weight for an assault on the hill.
But Johnson's division was not there.
No, they were trapped in a severe traffic jam. Because Lee's army was converging on a central hub, the separate columns eventually met and entangled.
And Johnson's infantry had the misfortune of marching behind the sprawling supply wagons of General Longstreet's corps.
Right, so these narrow dirt roads were completely blocked by hundreds of heavily laden wagons, mules, and artillery caissons.
The infantry was forced to halt and just wait for the roads to clear, which delayed their arrival until dusk.
So by the time Johnson's men navigated the logistical bottleneck and reached Ewell's position, the sun was setting.
Ewell sent skirmishers forward to probe the Union defenses and discovered that the heights were no longer held by a disorganized mob.
Yeah, the Union forces had dragged artillery batteries to the summit, and fresh infantry from the 12th Corps were beginning to arrive and reinforce the adjacent Culp's Hill.
So the window for a rapid, unsupported assault had essentially closed.
It had. Ewell's decision allowed the Union Army a 12-hour reprieve to consolidate their forces on the heights.
And understanding why those specific heights were so formidable requires us to shift our perspective from 19th century military logistics to deep-time geology.
Which is a fascinating shift, because to comprehend the defensive power of the Union line at Gettysburg, we have to pause the battle narrative and look at the physical dirt and rock beneath the soldiers' boots.
The story of those hills begins roughly 200 million years ago during the Triassic and Jurassic periods.
Right. The landscape of Adams County is defined by a geological feature known as a Triassic sedimentary rift basin.
Because millions of years ago, the supercontinent of Pangaea began to tear apart.
And as the continental plates separated, large rift valleys formed. Over immense spans of time, these valleys filled with layers of mud, silt, and sand,
which compressed into relatively soft sedimentary rocks like shale and sandstone.
But then, during the Jurassic period, the violent tectonic activity pulling the continent apart caused superheated magma from the Earth's mantle to rise toward the surface.
And this magma intruded into the weak points of the softer sedimentary layers.
Right. And it's important to note, the magma did not erupt as a volcano. Rather, it cooled and crystallized slowly deep underground, forming a tremendously dense, hard igneous rock known as diabase or dolerite.
These underground magma formations are called sills and dikes.
Exactly. And over the subsequent millions of years, the softer sedimentary shale and sandstone covering the area eroded away at a faster rate than the hard igneous rock.
So the differential erosion left the dense diabase intrusions exposed above the surrounding plain, which created a series of prominent rocky ridges and hills.
And when you trace the outcropping of this specific diabase sill on a map, it forms a distinct shape that defined the entire battle.
It is the shape of a fishhook.
Yeah, the topographical fishhook became the precise blueprint for the Union defensive line.
For you listening, try to visualize it. The southern anchor, the eye of the hook, rested on a massive wooded diabase hill called Big Round Top.
And moving north from there, the line followed a slightly lower elevation called Cemetery Ridge, which formed the long, straight shank of the hook.
The line then hit the prominent elevation of Cemetery Hill, where it bent sharply to the east, forming the curve of the fishhook.
And then it terminated at another rugged, densely wooded diabase outcrop known as Culp's Hill, which served as the barb.
So by occupying this igneous outcropping, the Union Army secured several commanding tactical advantages.
First and foremost, they held the high ground. In an era of black powder weapons, elevation provided superior fields of fire for both infantry and artillery.
And it granted the commanding generals a clear vantage point to observe the enemy's movements across the valleys below.
Furthermore, any Confederate assault would require a physically draining uphill charge.
But, and this is crucial, standing on a solid shelf of cooled underground magma presents a significant engineering challenge for a defending army.
Right, because the soil layer resting on top of the diabase sill is exceptionally shallow.
When the Union soldiers attempted to dig standard trenches or rifle pits with their bayonets and tin cups, they struck solid bedrock, mere inches below the surface.
Yeah, entrenching downward was mechanically impossible across much of the line. So to create fortifications, they had to build upward.
And once again, the specific geological history of the region provided the building materials.
Right, during the Pleistocene epoch, the area experienced severe periglacial conditions. Water would seep into the natural fractures of the exposed diabase rock, freeze, and expand.
A process known as frost wedging.
Exactly. And that shattered the solid sill over thousands of years, covering the slopes of Culp's Hill and the Round Tops with thousands of massive, loose boulders.
So the Union troops utilized this glacial debris. They gathered the loose periglacial rocks, combined them with felled timber, fence rails, and whatever loose earth they could scrape together.
And they constructed formidable breastworks above the ground. They created artificial stone walls that snaked through the woods, providing excellent protection against musket fire.
Conversely, we must examine the ground occupied by the Confederate forces. General Lee established his primary line along Seminary Ridge, which runs parallel to Cemetery Ridge, roughly a mile to the west.
And Seminary Ridge, as well as the broad, open valley separating the two armies, is composed of the softer, easily eroded sedimentary shales and sandstones of the Gettysburg Formation.
So the sedimentary geology produced a flatter, more fertile terrain that had been cleared for agriculture.
Which provided the Confederates with wide-open fields that allowed their infantry brigades to form up and maneuver in standard linear formations.
But the critical drawback was that these sedimentary plains offered virtually no natural cover.
Right. The topography dictated that any Confederate attack would have to originate from the lower elevation, cross 3/4 of a mile of exposed farmland, and ascend the rocky, fortified slopes of the diabase sill.
All while under direct fire from the heights.
Exactly. And this juxtaposition of the igneous defensive line and the sedimentary offensive plain set the parameters for the second day of the battle, July 2nd, 1863.
Because Meade had successfully concentrated the vast majority of the Army of the Potomac along the fishhook.
And this compact, continuous formation granted Meade a powerful operational asset known as interior lines.
The concept of interior lines is really essential for understanding the Union's resilience here.
It is, because the fishhook was a tightly curved formation, roughly 3 miles long from Culp's Hill to Little Round Top. Meade's logistical and communication routes were remarkably short.
He could utilize the roads behind his lines to rapidly shift infantry brigades from a quiet sector on the right flank directly across the chord of the arc.
Right, to reinforce a threatened sector on the left flank?
Yeah. The geometry worked entirely against the Confederates. Lee's army was deployed in a massive exterior arc wrapping around the outside of the Union position.
Their lines stretched for nearly 7 miles from the southern end of Seminary Ridge all the way through the town and wrapping around to the east side of Culp's Hill.
And operating on exterior lines in the mid-19th century was an immense communication challenge.
Oh, massive. Orders had to be handwritten by staff officers and carried by couriers on horseback.
So if Lee, positioned near the center on Seminary Ridge, needed to coordinate a simultaneous attack between Longstreet on his far right and Ewell on his far left.
The couriers had to ride miles over congested, unfamiliar roads. Synchronizing movements across a 7-mile front was highly susceptible to friction and delays.
But despite the profound advantages of the high ground and interior lines, the integrity of the Union defense was severely compromised on the afternoon of July 2nd by the actions of a single corps commander.
Yeah, Major General Daniel Sickles, commanding the Union 3rd Corps, was assigned to hold the southern portion of Cemetery Ridge, anchoring his left flank near the rocky base of Little Round Top.
But Sickles surveyed the ground he was ordered to defend and found it lacking.
He noted that the terrain immediately to his front dropped slightly before rising again to a slightly higher elevation along the Emmitsburg Road, an area featuring a prominent peach orchard.
And Sickles feared that if the Confederates placed artillery on that slight rise, they could bombard his lines.
So without securing permission from General Meade, Sickles ordered his entire corps of roughly 10,000 men to break out of the fishhook formation and march forward half a mile to occupy the peach orchard.
So Sickles' unauthorized movement violated the basic principles of defensive geometry. By advancing his corps, he created a salient.
Right, and for those listening, a salient is a line that projects outward into enemy territory, forming an exposed angle. His new position resembled a V pointing directly toward the Confederate lines.
And a salient is notoriously difficult to defend.
Very difficult. The troops occupying the tip of the angle can be subjected to converging fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Furthermore, the extended perimeter stretches the defending force thin.
But the most catastrophic consequence of Sickles' maneuver was what he left behind.
Exactly. By marching forward to the Emmitsburg Road, he completely abandoned the southern anchor of the Union line. He left the heights of Little Round Top entirely devoid of infantry.
Think of it this way. If you push the keystone out of an archway, the entire structure is compromised. Little Round Top was the keystone of the Union left flank.
If Confederate artillery could secure the summit of that hill, they had fire enfilade down the entire length of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, making the position untenable.
Sickles had inadvertently handed Lee the key to unraveling the entire Army of the Potomac.
And Lee's operational plan for July 2nd was designed to exploit exactly that kind of vulnerability. He ordered a coordinated echelon attack.
General Longstreet's First Corps was to attack the Union left flank, rolling up the line from south to north.
While Ewell's corps would launch demonstration against Culp's Hill on the right flank, pinning Union troops in place and converting the demonstration into a full assault if the opportunity arose.
However, the friction of exterior lines and the necessity of secrecy severely delayed the execution of the plan. Longstreet's corps did not launch their attack until approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
And that delay was primarily caused by the march to the deployment area. Lee wanted Longstreet to position his troops without being detected by the Union signalmen operating from a station on Little Round Top.
But when Longstreet's column approached a rise in the road that was visible from the signal station, he ordered a time-consuming countermarch.
Yeah, they had to backtrack and find a longer, concealed route through the woods, marching several extra miles in the oppressive summer heat just to remain undetected.
When Longstreet finally deployed his divisions, the assault was massive. Major General Lafayette McLaws' division smashed into Sickles' vulnerable salient at the Peach Orchard and the nearby wheat field.
And the fighting in the wheat field was a horrific, swirling melee. Control of the field changed hands multiple times as Union reinforcements fed into the grinder and Confederate brigades pushed forward.
Sickles' extended line just shattered under the pressure. Sickles himself was struck in the leg by a solid artillery projectile, shattering the bone and removing him from the field.
So Meade was forced to fully utilize his interior lines, frantically pulling brigades and divisions from the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps, funneling them into the collapsing salient.
Trying to prevent the Confederates from breaking through to the rear of the army.
Right. And while the salient crumbled, Longstreet's other division, commanded by Major General John Bell Hood, swung further south. Hood's brigades bypassed the Peach Orchard and advanced directly toward the rocky slopes of the Round Tops.
Which brings us to the late afternoon crisis on the extreme left flank. Union Brigadier General Gouverneur K. Warren, the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac, recognized the strategic peril.
He rode to the summit of Little Round Top, which was occupied only by a handful of signalmen.
And looking down through the trees to the southwest, Warren saw the glint of sunlight reflecting off the bayonets of Hood's advancing infantry, heading straight for the undefended hill.
Warren understood that if the Confederates reached the summit first, the battle was lost. He dispatched staff officers on horseback, ordering them to find any available infantry and bring them to the hill immediately.
And one of those frantic couriers intercepted a brigade of the Union 5th Corps moving toward the wheat field. The brigade was commanded by Colonel Strong Vincent.
And exercising remarkable battlefield initiative, Vincent did not wait to confirm the orders through his chain of command.
He recognized the emergency, diverted his 4 regiments, the 16th Michigan, the 44th New York, the 83rd Pennsylvania, and the 20th Maine.
And he double-quicked them up the rugged, pathless rear slope of Little Round Top.
Vincent's troops arrived on the southern spur of the hill and formed a hasty defensive line among the massive periglacial boulders just 10 minutes before the lead elements of Hood's division began their ascent.
10 minutes. And the anchor of Vincent's line was the extreme left flank, assigned to Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine Infantry.
Chamberlain's orders were explicit. He was the end of the line. If his position failed, the Confederate Army would wrap around the rear of the Union forces.
The troops assaulting Chamberlain's position were primarily from the 15th Alabama Infantry, commanded by Colonel William Oates.
And when evaluating the combat capabilities of the Alabama troops at that moment, their physical condition is a crucial factor.
Oh, absolutely. They had marched over 20 miles that day, navigating dusty roads under a sweltering July sun just to reach the battlefield.
Their canteens were completely empty. As they prepared to deploy, they were denied permission to halt and forage for water.
So they were ordered to charge up a steep, heavily wooded hill composed of jagged dye-base while suffering from severe dehydration and physical exhaustion.
The combat on the slopes of Little Round Top was intimate and brutal. It devolved into squad-level fighting among the house-sized boulders.
The Alabamians launched multiple determined charges, pushing the 20th Maine back, forcing Chamberlain's line to bend back upon itself like a hairpin.
The casualties were severe, and after an hour of sustained combat, the men of the 20th Maine exhausted their standard issue of 60 rounds of ammunition per man.
They were resorting to scavenging cartridges from the cartridge boxes of the dead and wounded.
So Chamberlain faced an untenable tactical situation. His men lacked the ammunition to repel another concerted assault, and a retreat would collapse the entire flank.
He chose a desperate offensive maneuver. He ordered his men to fix bayonets.
He executed a maneuver known as a right wheel forward.
Right. And in a right wheel forward, the right flank of the regiment holds its pivot point, while the center and left swing forward aggressively,
Sweeping down the hill, much like a heavy door swinging shut on its hinges.
It relies entirely on shock action and momentum.
And the sudden, roaring bayonet charge from troops who were expected to be completely broken shattered the cohesion of the exhausted Alabamians.
Furthermore, Chamberlain benefited from a critical, hidden, tactical asset.
Right. Prior to the engagement, Chamberlain had detached Company B of his regiment, along with a few men from the 2nd United States Sharpshooters, positioning them behind a stone wall further down the slope to the east to guard against a flanking maneuver.
So as the 15th Alabama fell back in disarray from the bayonet charge, they were suddenly struck by enfilading fire from this hidden detachment.
Disoriented, exhausted, and believing they were surrounded by a much larger force, hundreds of Confederate soldiers surrendered. The left flank was secured.
But the defense of the hill required more than just infantry. At the same time the 20th Maine was fighting on the slope, Union artillerymen were attempting to bring cannons to the rocky summit.
And the effort required to move Hazlitt's battery up the rear of Little Round Top really demonstrates the sheer physical labor of 19th century warfare.
It does, because artillery of that era was extraordinarily heavy. A standard 10-pounder Parrott rifle or 12-pounder Napoleon cannon, including its carriage, weighed well over 1,000 pounds.
And because there was no road up the hill, the horses could not gain traction on the steep, boulder-strewn incline.
So Union infantrymen had to physically grab the spokes of the wheels and drag the cannons up the slope by hand, heaving them over rocks and through the dense underbrush.
It was a monumental display of physical exertion, but once the cannons reached the summit, the geological reality of the hill severely limited their effectiveness.
Yeah, the dye-base outcropping formed a very steep crest. When the artillerymen placed their cannons on the summit and attempted to fire at the Confederate infantry fighting in the area known as Devil's Den directly below, they found that they could not depress the barrels of the cannons low enough.
The carriage mechanics prevented them from aiming sharply downward.
Consequently, much of their fire sailed harmlessly over the heads of the infantry below them, although the sheer noise and presence of the guns provided a vital psychological boost to the Union defenders.
And the men operating those guns were fully exposed to Confederate sharpshooters firing upward from the massive boulders of Devil's Den.
The battery commander, Lieutenant Charles Hazlitt, was struck in the head and killed while trying to communicate with General Stephen Weed, who was also mortally wounded near the guns.
Now, while the crisis on the left flank consumed Meade's attention, the Confederate plan required a simultaneous attack on the right flank. General Ewell's 2nd Corps launched their assaults against Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill as evening approached.
And the survival of the Union right flank on Culp's Hill is a direct testament to the value of field engineering.
The defense of the hill was anchored by a brigade commanded by Brigadier General George S. Greene.
Greene was unique among the commanders on the field. He was a trained civil engineer, and at 62 years old, he was a veteran who understood the defensive power of earth and wood.
So when Greene's brigade arrived on Culp's Hill earlier in the day, His troops were exhausted and wanted to rest.
Greene, however, recognized that his sector was vulnerable. Despite grumbling from his men and skepticism from his superiors, Greene issued strict orders for his brigade to immediately begin constructing substantial breastworks.
They spent hours filling heavy timber, digging into the shallow soil where possible, and piling the loose periglacial rocks.
They constructed a continuous line of deep, thick fortifications that utilized the proper angle of repose to deflect incoming fire. They built a defensive trench system above ground.
And that engineering effort saved the flank.
It absolutely did. During the crisis on the left, Meade had stripped away the vast majority of the 12th Corps from Culp's Hill to reinforce the Peach Orchard, leaving Greene's single brigade of roughly 1,400 men to hold a line designed for an entire corps.
So when Ewell's Confederate divisions, numbering nearly 5,000 men, advanced up the steep wooded slopes of Culp's Hill in the gathering darkness, they encountered a wall of timber spitting sustained rifle fire.
The Confederates attacked the breastworks repeatedly, taking horrifying casualties in the dark, but Greene's men, protected by the thick logs and rocks, repulsed every assault.
The fortifications absorbed the Confederate lead, demonstrating that disciplined engineering could overcome a massive numerical disadvantage.
Meanwhile, the fighting spilled over to the adjacent East Cemetery Hill, where Confederate brigades managed to breach the Union lines in the dark, overrunning artillery positions.
Desperate hand-to-hand combat raged among the cannons.
But the Union commanders utilized their interior lines once again, rushing reinforcements into the breach and driving the Confederates back down the hill.
The combat on East Cemetery Hill produced one of the most sobering vignettes of the battle. Colonel Isaac Avery, commanding a brigade of North Carolina troops, was leading the charge up the slope when a musket ball struck him in the neck, paralyzing his right side and severing an artery.
Unable to speak as he lay bleeding on the dark hillside, he managed to extract a piece of paper and a pencil with his left hand.
He scrawled a note to a nearby staff officer that read, "Tell my father I died with my face to the enemy."
It is a stark reminder of the individual human cost that accompanies the grand strategic movements. By midnight on July 2nd, the fighting subsided.
The Union fishhook had been severely battered, the salient had been crushed, and the flanks had been stretched to the breaking point, but the line remained intact.
That night, Meade convened a council of war with his remaining corps commanders in a small farmhouse.
They discussed the state of their supplies, the exhaustion of the men, and the tactical situation. They unanimously voted to remain on the fishhook and fight a defensive battle on July 3rd.
And the third day of the battle commenced exactly where the second day ended. Before dawn on July 3rd, Union artillery opened fire on Confederate units that had occupied abandoned Union trenches at the base of Culp's Hill during the night.
A sustained, brutal infantry firefight erupted as Union forces counterattacked to push the Confederates out.
The fighting on Culp's Hill raged for 7 hours. General Lee, attempting to coordinate a simultaneous attack across his entire line, sent orders to Ewell to suspend his assaults until the main offensive could be organized.
And Ewell's response really illustrates the complete breakdown of command control once units are engaged. He sent word back that it was too late to recall. The momentum of the combat was irreversible.
By late morning, the Union troops had completely secured Culp's Hill and reestablished their formidable defensive line.
So Lee's strategic options were rapidly narrowing. He had launched massive assaults against both the Union left and the Union right, and both had ultimately failed to dislodge Meade's army from the Dives Heights.
Operating under the assumption that Meade had aggressively utilized his interior lines to shift troops from the center to reinforce the heavily engaged flanks, Lee arrived at a logical tactical deduction.
He reasoned that if the flanks were heavily defended, the center of the Union line, located on the long, straight shank of Cemetery Ridge, must be stretched thin and vulnerable.
Right. Relying on the military principle of concentrating maximum force against a perceived weak point, Lee designed a massive infantry assault aimed directly at a small copse of trees marking the center of the Union line.
But analyzing the topography of the field makes this decision highly controversial. The Union infantry was positioned behind a low stone wall on an elevated ridge.
They possessed a clear, unobstructed field of fire sweeping across 3/4 of a mile of open sedimentary farmland.
Given the clear lines of sight from the Union high ground, wasn't sending infantry across 3/4 of a mile of open sedimentary farmland a known suicidal tactic by this point in the war?
It seems strategically unsound, particularly in the third year of a war defined by the defensive power of rifled weaponry.
Because the lethality of the rifled musket, which fired a conical lead bullet called a mini-ball, meant that defenders could accurately engage attacking formations at ranges of up to 400 yards.
Far exceeding the range of the smoothbore muskets used in previous conflicts. To mitigate this severe disadvantage, Lee's plan hinged entirely on the successful execution of a massive preliminary artillery bombardment.
So the plan was not to send infantry against a fully intact defensive line.
No, the blueprint called for the Confederate artillery to obliterate the Union batteries, destroy the stone walls, and demoralize the defending infantry. The infantry charge was intended to be a mopping-up operation.
To achieve this, the Confederate artillery chief, Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, amassed roughly 120 cannons along the length of Seminary Ridge.
And at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they opened fire simultaneously. It was the largest concentrated artillery barrage of the war in the Eastern Theater. The concussive force was felt for miles.
But the bombardment failed to achieve its primary objective. The logistical constraints and the physical environment intervened to protect the Union center. Why was this massive barrage so ineffective?
The failure stems from several mechanical and environmental factors. First, the intense volume of fire rapidly produced thick clouds of dense black powder smoke that hung over the valley in the humid July air.
This smoke obscured the target, blinding the Confederate gunners and forcing them to fire blindly based on their initial targeting calculations.
Second, we have to look at the physics of the cannons themselves. The Confederate batteries were firing from Seminary Ridge, aiming slightly upward towards Cemetery Ridge.
And when a cannon fires, the violent expansion of gases forces the carriage backward in a sharp recoil.
Right, the trail spade of the carriage digs into the earth. On a slight incline, this repeated recoil action subtly elevates the barrel of the cannon with each successive shot.
Because the gunners could not see the target through the smoke to correct their aim, this creeping elevation caused the vast majority of the Confederate artillery shells to overshoot the Union front line.
Furthermore, the Confederacy struggled with manufacturing consistent fuses for their explosive shells. Many of the Borman fuses burned too slowly, causing the shells to explode high in the air or far behind the lines among the Union supply wagons and field hospitals, leaving the infantry behind the stone wall largely unscathed.
Now, the Union artillery commander, Brigadier General Henry Hunt, executed a brilliant tactical deception during the barrage.
He recognized the necessity of conserving his limited ammunition for the impending infantry assault. He ordered the Union batteries to gradually slow their rate of fire and eventually fall completely silent.
So to the Confederate commanders observing through the smoke, the silencing of the Union guns indicated that the barrage had succeeded.
They believed they had destroyed the Union artillery capability. Acting on this false assumption, the order was given to advance.
At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 12,500 Confederate soldiers stepped out from the tree line on Seminary Ridge and formed massive linear battle lines stretching for over a mile.
This is the event famously known as Pickett's Charge, though it encompassed divisions commanded by Generals Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble.
And the mechanics of the charge really illustrate the terrifying lethality of 19th century artillery. As soon as the Confederate formation stepped into the open, the Union batteries that were assumed destroyed opened a devastating fire.
Because the Union position maintained its fishhook shape, the cannons stationed on Cemetery Hill to the north and Little Round Top to the south possessed a clear line of sight down the flanks of the advancing lines.
This is known as enfilading fire. Instead of firing straight into the front of a line, where a cannonball might strike 1 or 2 men, an enfilading shot travels longitudinally down the length of the formation, tearing through an entire rank of soldiers.
And the Union gunners utilized different types of ammunition depending on the range. At maximum range, they fired a solid iron shot, which was designed to bounce and tear through formations.
As the Confederates closed the distance to roughly half a mile, the gunners switched to spherical case shot. These were hollow iron spheres filled with lead balls and a time fuse, designed to explode in the air over the advancing troops, showering them with shrapnel.
Despite the staggering casualties, the Confederate discipline held, and the lines continued to advance, closing the distance across the sedimentary plain.
But halfway across the field, they encountered a severe physical obstacle: the sturdy wooden fences lining the Emmitsburg Road.
The fences broke the momentum of the charge. The soldiers were forced to halt, bunch up, and physically climb over or tear down the heavy wooden rails, all while under intense, concentrated fire.
This pause in the killing zone amplified the casualties significantly.
Once they crossed the road and closed to within a few hundred yards of the Union lines, the artillerymen switched to their most lethal ammunition canister.
A canister round was essentially a tin cylinder packed with dozens of large iron balls. When fired, the tin casing disintegrated, turning the cannon into a massive, widespread shotgun.
Capable of tearing gaping holes in densely packed infantry formations at close range.
The combined effect of canister fire and volley fire from the Union infantry behind the stone wall caused the Confederate divisions on the left, commanded by Pettigrew and Trimble, to fragment and collapse.
The casualty rate was catastrophic. However, the division on the right, commanded by Major General George Pickett, managed to maintain its cohesion and push toward the angle in the stone wall near the copse of trees.
Elements of Pickett's division, led by Brigadier General Lewis Armistead, broke through the Union defensive line. Armistead famously placed his hat on the tip of his sword, held it aloft as a guide for his men, and leaped over the stone wall, capturing a Union artillery piece.
This localized breach represents the high water mark of the Confederacy. For a fleeting moment, they had pierced the center of the Army of the Potomac.
But the Union's interior lines immediately neutralized the threat. General Hancock rushed reserve regiments from adjacent sectors to seal the breach.
The Confederate troops who had crossed the wall were quickly surrounded, outnumbered, and overwhelmed in brutal hand-to-hand combat.
Armistead was mortally wounded, falling beside the cannon he had just captured. Recognizing that the attack had failed and no reinforcements were advancing to support them, the surviving Confederate soldiers broke and began a disorganized, agonizing retreat back across the corpse-strewn field to Seminary Ridge.
The statistical toll of the charge is grim. Of the roughly 12,500 men who advanced, approximately 6,000 became casualties in under an hour.
Entire regiments were decimated, losing their commanders, their flags, and a massive percentage of their fighting strength.
General Lee rode out to rally the survivors, publicly accepting full responsibility for the failure of the assault.
The third day concluded with the decisive repulse of the Confederate Army. The following day, July 4th, 1863, a torrential rainstorm swept across the battlefield.
The rain turned the dirt roads to mud and compounded the misery of the tens of thousands of wounded men scattered across the farms and ridges.
Lee realized his campaign was over. He had failed to break the Union Army, his ammunition was dangerously low, and he was deep in hostile territory.
He began the complex logistical operation of organizing a retreat back to Virginia. The 50-mile wagon train that had dictated his arrival was now transformed into an agonizing caravan of suffering, loaded with thousands of wounded men enduring the jolting ride in springless wooden wagons over muddy roads.
As Lee withdrew toward the swollen Potomac River, General Meade held his ground. Meade's decision not to launch a rapid, aggressive pursuit to destroy Lee's retreating army sparked intense criticism from President Lincoln, who believed Meade had squandered an opportunity to end the war.
But examining the logistical and physical state of the Army of the Potomac heavily defends Meade's caution. His army had just endured the largest and bloodiest battle in its history, suffering over 23,000 casualties.
The officer corps was depleted. The men were physically exhausted, having marched rapidly prior to the battle and fought for 3 grueling days.
Furthermore, Meade's own supply chains were stretched to their absolute limits. The army was running dangerously low on artillery ammunition, rations, and fresh horses.
Pursuing a highly dangerous, cornered enemy across flooded terrain while lacking sufficient supplies was an operational risk that Meade, having just secured a massive strategic victory, was unwilling to take.
While the army slowly departed the region, we must consider the horrific burden left upon the civilian population of Gettysburg. A small agricultural town of roughly 2,400 residents suddenly found itself responsible for the care of over 20,000 severely wounded soldiers from both sides.
Every barn, church, and private home was converted into a makeshift field hospital. The civilian population was thrust into the role of medical caretakers, dealing with amputations, disease, and starvation.
To manage the crisis, the Union Medical Department established Camp Letterman, a massive, consolidated tent hospital located in the woods east of town, designed to implement a centralized system of triage and care.
The recovery effort required an immense logistical mobilization. The United States Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission rapidly deployed agents and supplies to the area.
Railway engineers worked continuously to repair the damaged tracks leading into Gettysburg, allowing trains to deliver massive quantities of ice, bandages, and food, and subsequently evacuate the stabilized wounded to permanent military hospitals in major northern cities.
The scale of the battle naturally leads historians to debate its ultimate significance. Gettysburg is frequently characterized as the singular turning point of the American Civil War.
It undeniably shattered the offensive capability of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee would never again possess the numerical strength or the veteran leadership to launch a major invasion of Northern soil.
While the strategic momentum in the Eastern Theater shifted permanently to the Union, we must look at the broader continental picture. On the very same day that Lee began his retreat in the pouring rain, July 4, 1863, a pivotal event concluded in the Western Theater.
The Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi, formally surrendered to Union forces, commanded by Major General Ulysses S. Grant, following a grueling multi-month siege.
The capture of Vicksburg yielded profound strategic consequences. By securing total control of the Mississippi River, the Union effectively severed the Confederacy in half, isolating the resource-rich states of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the rest of the Southern war effort.
From a purely strategic standpoint, many military analysts argue that the loss of the Mississippi River at Vicksburg was a more fatal blow to the logistical survival of the Confederacy than the tactical defeat at Gettysburg.
However, the synchronized timing of the two events created an overwhelming psychological impact. The dramatic victory, stopping Lee's seemingly invincible army in Pennsylvania, coupled with the geographic severing of the Confederacy in Mississippi on the exact same day, signaled an irreversible turning of the tide.
It is the moment the physical and logistical reality of the war began to permanently crush the rebellion.
Which leaves us with the final point of analysis regarding the mechanics of the campaign. In the decades following the war, a popular narrative emerged, suggesting that on the second day of the battle, General Longstreet urged Lee to abandon the frontal assaults on the Diabase Hills.
The theory suggests Longstreet wanted to disengage, march the army south, swing completely around the Union left flank, and interpose the Confederate army between Meade and Washington, D.C.
It is a compelling counterfactual scenario. The logic suggests bypassing the strong defensive terrain and forcing Meade to attack the Confederates on ground of their choosing.
However, when we apply the logistical constraints we established at the beginning of this deep dive, the flanking maneuver reveals itself as practically impossible. To execute a deep turning movement around the Union flank, Lee would have had to move his entire army, and that meant relocating his 50-mile-long wagon train.
The road network south of Gettysburg could not support such a complex maneuver while in close proximity to the enemy. Attempting to drag thousands of cumbersome wagons down narrow dirt roads, while simultaneously shielding them from aggressive Union cavalry probes and shifting infantry corps, would have created a catastrophic logistical vulnerability.
The wagons would have been trapped and destroyed.
The sprawling, heavy logistical leash that Lee dragged into Pennsylvania prevented him from executing rapid, sweeping maneuvers once the armies were engaged. He did not simply choose to launch frontal assaults against a fortified fishhook. His massive supply chain effectively eliminated his ability to maneuver around it.
The 50-mile wagon train forced him to fight the battle that was in front of him.
The decisions on the battlefield were dictated not just by strategic vision, but by the physical limitations of the roads, the caloric requirements of the draft animals, and the deep-time geology of the ridges they fought upon.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.